Nō reira, without further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our very first speaker of the series, who is Michelle Liddicut. Michelle is a senior neurophysiotherapist with Rope Neuro in Auckland. She's just recently returned from the UK and she's sporting fabulous headgear this morning. So thank you so much, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Nicola, for the invitation to talk today, and apologies all for my bunny ears. I've had a little bit of technical issues this morning, and my daughter's headphones were the only ones I could find. I don't know, Rochelle, I don't seem to have my presentation here just yet. Here we go. Thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for the invite to speak with you today. I think it's a really important topic for helping people to keep active and exercising with multiple sclerosis. It can be an uncertain time when people have been diagnosed. And this is a way for people to be really proactive in looking after their health. And we know that exercising helps people with their mood and outlook on life too. So thank you once again. Can we change slides, please? So just a quick introduction about myself. I'm currently working, as Nicola said, at Rope Neuro Rehabilitation, which is located in Mount Eden in Auckland. I came to Auckland last year trying to dodge COVID in the UK, actually. And I originally am from Melbourne, actually, so I'm Australian. Apologies. I hope that doesn't upset anybody. But yeah, I'm from Melbourne and I've been living and working in London for the best part of 20 years. This picture on the right is the entrance to the hospital that I was working at last year, the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, where I was working with the MS therapy team, leading that team, and also dabbling a little bit in MS related research. So yeah, great time, but nice to be here. Can we change slides, please? Thanks, Michelle. So quick overview of today. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about what the definitions are so that the rest of the presentation flows well. Some of the benefits of exercise and physical activity for your general well-being and health, and then delving into some of the specific benefits of exercise and physical activity with relation to MS specifically. We'll talk about the current exercise guidelines, some principles to make it safe and effective, and then I'm trying to keep it as practical as possible, helping people just to sort of become more active and top practical tips. Okay, change slide, thank you. So yeah, just a quick review of definitions, because people bandy these things about, and I think it's worthwhile just spending some time to make sure that we understand what they are. So physical activity is basically doing anything that requires movement. So it's essentially not sitting and it's not lying down, but anything other than that. So getting out of bed, walking to the kitchen, popping to the shops, meeting up with a friend for a chat and a walk, that's all physical activity. It's not particularly structured and it can be ad hoc, whereas exercise is planned, structured, repetitive, and it aims to improve physical fitness. So there's intention there. Okay, and that could be on a spectrum from endurance exercise, where you've got low loads over a long period of time, like running, walking, cycling, or it could be fitness, like strength training, where you've got higher loads and over a shorter period of time. Next, thank you. While talking about that, I also need to just briefly touch upon sedentary behavior, so sitting, lying down. We know that unfortunately, when we look at the literature, that people with MS are typically less active than the general population, and that more time is spent sitting down than in physical activity, and that time in sitting is accumulated over longer periods, especially in the afternoon and in the evenings. And unfortunately, this places people at risk of other comorbidities due to those behaviours, rather than necessarily the multiple sclerosis itself. So I think it's worth recognising that so that we can have great intention in terms of changing those day-to-day activities. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm sure we've all heard this phrase, if exercise were a pill, it would be the most prescribed drug on the planet. And rather than letting that send you into a shame spiral of thinking, okay, well, it's so good for me, I'm not doing it, I'm bad, I'm doing a bad job. I think it's helpful to understand why it would be so prescribed. When we think about other medications, so say for cardiovascular health, blood pressure, cholesterol, they target certain aspects of our body systems and our health, really specific. Whereas exercise is a really potent intervention that affects all of the systems basically in our body. So it affects obviously our muscles and our joints and helps to keep them strong and functioning well. It affects our cardiovascular system, so our heart and our blood vessels, our breathing, so that we can get the oxygen to our muscles and be effective with our movements. But it also affects other things that may not be quite so obvious. It affects our well-being, our cognition, because we evolved to be moving beasts. We worked in teams to track down animals and to find the right plants to eat. And so we had to communicate, we had to work together and understand each other's movements and plan and anticipate the outcomes of those things. So when we move, we don't just switch on our muscle system, we switch on our brain system, our cognition, our planning, our executive function. And so when we think about exercise, it really has very diverse impacts. And the good thing about exercise when compared with perhaps other sort of medical drugs is that the downsides are very low. There's no nasty side effects really of exercise, only good things to be had. The next slide, please. So just to get a little more specific, when you look at different countries, they've all got their physical activity guidelines and they all try and tell you exactly, how it's going to help you. So these are just a few examples that I've taken from the Victorian government actually, but there is more from the Ministry of Health here in New Zealand also. But it affects your cardiovascular system, obviously reduce risk of heart attack, it helps to manage weight, lower blood cholesterol, reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes and some cancers, lowers blood pressure, improves bone strength, muscles, reduces the risk of osteoporosis, reduces the risk of falls, and more importantly, or as importantly rather, it helps you to feel more energetic, more optimistic, and can reduce anxiety, which will help with sleep also. So really diverse benefits of exercise. Next slide, please. And delving into the MS literature a little bit more, we know that physical activity is really positive for brain health, as I started to allude to a moment ago, in that it's neuroprotective. It helps our brain to cope with stresses better, in that it helps to balance our neurotransmitters that switch on and dampen down our brain circuitry. We know that it reduces the inflammation in the central nervous system, which in multiple sclerosis is an inflammatory component to this disease process. And so if we can help to manage that, it has been found to actually reduce relapse rate by up to 27%, which is about a third. So that's a huge difference actually, if we can get in and do enough to have those effects. It's neuroregenerative. So when when MRI studies have been undertaken with people with MS, they've found that actually it helps to improve brain volumes, particularly in certain parts of the brain like the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that helps with memory and learning, as well as the basal ganglia and the thalamus, which are parts of the brain that help us with our movement and integrating information to help us to move better. And so really nice positive effects of exercise there. The other thing is that it helps, it's neuroplastic. And what I mean by that is that plasticity, that ability of the brain to change and adapt to what we ask it to do. So it helps us to modulate our nerve circuits, so to make them more efficient, so that we can respond in more appropriate ways to the environment around us. So for example, that might help us to balance better or to move more efficiently so we can walk a bit further or faster, or to use our hands better. So Yeah, so lots and lots of positive implications for the brain and central nervous system. Thanks, Michelle. And just once again, just to ram it home, so many different types of exercise. So different types of exercise, aerobic, so that's your, longer, more endurance exercises where you get your heart rate up, your breathing rate up for a bit longer, has lots of effects on your muscle mass, strength, activity, disease risk, cognition, depression, fatigue. And then at the bottom, I like this one the most, actually, just your quality of life for all of those reasons. The aerobic exercise is particularly important in terms of generating this brain-derived neurotrophic factor that helps to drive improvements in brain structure and function. Next slide, please. So exercise, what is it? There are different types of exercises, and it's been investigated quite a lot actually in multiple sclerosis, particularly in people with mild to moderate symptoms. And so it's generally broken down into two types. So there's resistance exercise, which is basically strengthening, where you might lift weights or other things, but it's against a load. And the recommendation, which has come out of meta-analyses and systematic reviews, is that we should be doing that 2 to 3 times a week at a moderate intensity. So what they mean by that is 60 to 80% of your 1 repetition maximum. So that sounds all a bit gobbledygook perhaps, but basically what it means is if you're doing 10 repetitions, you should feel about 6 to 8 out of 10 tired in your muscles, is the way I tell people that I'm working with. You need to feel like they've worked and that they've been challenged for us to make a change to the muscle strength and activation. And usually we do that for one to 3 sets, depending on how you're able to do, like if you're able to do that yet, or you might build up to 3 sets. And you need to have a break between each of those sets to give the muscles a chance just to rest, because you're really recruiting a lot of that muscle. And the thing about resistance exercise, which people often like, is that you shouldn't do it on consecutive days, really. You do that with a day in between for the muscles to repair and regenerate, so you can then go again. The other main type of exercise is aerobic exercise. So this is something that people are usually pretty familiar with. So that would be low load endurance type work. So walking, cycling, running, bike, rower machine, elliptical trainer, upper limb cycling, any of those things that get your heart rate up, make you feel a bit sweaty, and get you breathing a bit harder. So the recommendation is that we should be doing that 2 to 3 times a week at a moderate intensity. So as I said, you should feel like you can maybe talk, or but you shouldn't be able to sing while you're exercising. That you should be able to talk in reasonable sentences, but you should feel like you're working. And doing that for 30 minutes. And you can do that more than that. This is the minimal requirement for getting the health benefits that we're after. Okay, next slide, thank you. And MS doesn't change everything. The same principles apply. So when you're trying to make changes to your physical capacity, we need to think about how am I responding to this exercise. So you might find that initially it takes you a bit longer to recover from exercise. And so just listening to your body and thinking about how you're responding, and maybe I'll do something a bit lighter, or actually I recovered really, really quickly and I'm going to go a bit harder next time. We need to think about the specificity of our exercise. So if you're thinking about you wanting to improve your walking, for example, you'd need to practice walking. Okay, you can't expect your walking to change if you then just only train in the pool, because it's a different environment with different challenges that your body is needing to adapt to. So whilst people might develop certain aspects, so you might consider doing balance training, or be working on some weights and doing those other things as well. If you're specifically wanting to change your walking, then you need to practice walking. And there are lots of ways to help you to do that. It needs to be progressive. So as we've sort of alluded to already, you need to be working hard to get those changes. If we only work where we're not really taxing our muscles or taxing our balance, then we wouldn't expect to see change, because the brain likes that problem and that challenge to have to solve, and the muscles need to adapt to load. So you need to be progressive. You can't do the same exercise at the same rate for a long period of time and expect to still see the same changes. And this is one that people are very familiar with, this reversibility. So use it or lose it. Unfortunately, if I exercised 6 months ago, I couldn't expect to still see the benefit from that now. I'd need to continue to exercise to maintain those health and benefits. Next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So one of the things that is always important to broach, I think, is it safe? Exercising with multiple sclerosis is safe. We've already touched upon the fact that sedentary behaviour puts you at greater risk of health problems, or actually it reduces your life expectancy, unfortunately, for all of us, not just for people with MS. But essentially what they found is, as I've mentioned, that regular exercise training at a therapeutic dose, so according to those guidelines that I've just talked about, had an improvement or a reduced rate of relapse by 27% compared with controls. That's just sort of let that sink in. That's really positive change. And while approximately 40% of people do experience some worsening of their symptoms, it normalizes usually within 30 minutes of stopping, and in 85% of people, and within a couple of hours for the rest when they've looked at that in studies. So I think understanding that you might experience a slight worsening of your symptoms for a short period of time, but that overall in the longer term, exercise is really beneficial. It's really important to understand that, because I can understand that if you experienced more symptoms, it would be off-putting. So I think recognizing that that is possible, but it will normalize is a good place to start. Other things that we can consider are just building up gradually, setting up your environment. So if you're feeling a little unsteady on your feet, consider where you're doing it. Maybe don't do it in the middle of a room next to a glass table. And we're going to touch a little bit more upon heat sensitivity later in the talk, but keeping yourself cool will help you to reduce your worsening of symptoms after doing exercise. But absolutely, exercise is safe. I think that definitely I would hope that all medical professionals are promoting exercise rather than saying take it easy, don't do too much or go too hard, as they would have done in the past when we didn't understand this nearly so well. Next slide, please. So practical part of the talk, let's talk about top tips to get active. Next slide, please. So the first one is to start by breaking up sitting. So even if you are exercising every day and you're fulfilling those exercise requirements, if you then sit for the rest of the day, that will probably be less helpful in that you will have all of those negative connotations of having a lot of sedentary behavior. So we need to be breaking up our sitting for our general health, our blood sugar regulation, keeping our muscles supple and flexible, our postural stability, and to build up that endurance that helps us to function across a day. So things that you can do to help do that are to set a timer on your phone, or sorry, someone's not muted and I can hear them quite a lot. I don't know if we can just mute whoever that is. Sorry. So what I will often ask people I'm working with to do is just to look back, reflect on their pedometer on their phone, because it tells you sort of how many steps you're taking in a day. And also it tells you, when you look at it a bit more in depth, is that when you're taking those steps. So you can see whether you're distributing that activity across the day, or whether you are spending large swathes of your time sat down. And when I'm saying to break up your sitting, I don't mean that you have to get up and go for a 15-minute walk. It really is just breaking up your sitting, getting up, going to the kitchen, getting a drink of water, or popping to the loo, or walking outside to drink in this lovely fresh air that we have in Auckland and New Zealand, rather than gritty diesel fumes in London. Or just any little thing to break it up, get your body a little bit more online again, and to make that connection to your physical self. I know it's really hard at the moment in a COVID time where we're all kind of locked on Zoom screens and somewhat sort of stifled in terms of our ability to get out and about. But it's a really important thing to do, and a great place to start this sort of change in our lifestyle to get those benefits. Next slide, thanks, Michelle. The second tip is just to increase your lifestyle physical activity. So remembering that physical activity is just getting moving. And I think the best way to do this is linked a little bit with the previous point, is to say, look at your phone. You might and see how many steps you're taking and how regularly you're doing it. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be going to the gym to get active. Just going for a walk around the block. Look at these people. They're so excited to be walking down the aisle of that supermarket. I'm not such a fan of hoovering, but or vacuuming, I think we probably call it here. But it all counts towards getting you active. And the nice thing about it is that if fatigue is a problem, which it can be for some people, is that you can do them in little bite-sized chunks across the course of the day. 5 minutes here or there, it all counts, and something is better than nothing. Next slide, thanks, Michelle. So the other thing I will often mention to people is to consciously schedule it into your day. Like you would with your meetings and work at work, thinking about how are you going to fit this exercise into your day. It's all very well and good to say, right, I'm going to exercise 3 times a week, and I'm going to go for a walk every day, and I'm going to do all of this great stuff. But the thing is that life will often get in the way. So thinking about consciously scheduling it into your day, plan ahead. If you're thinking about getting up and doing exercise in the morning, get that exercise gear out and next to your bed. It's hard enough for us to motivate ourselves to exercise, and this is everybody, without then putting barriers in the way. So have it accessible, make it possible with the least interference as possible. For me, I keep my kettlebells in my lounge room, which doesn't look great, but that just reminds me, come on, you're waiting for the kettle to boil. Let's pick up that kettlebell and just do five lifts or something. Thinking about looking for opportunities to exercise. So for example, if you're going to the supermarket, could I park the car further away from the entrance to the supermarket? So I'm just doing that little bit extra. And then you can try and park a little further away or around the corner or something like that. When there's stairs next to the lifts, just think about taking the stairs. Even if you can't do the whole number of stair levels, then you might be able to do 1 and then pop in the lift. But trying to look for those opportunities to incorporate it and make it a habit in your day will really pay dividends. But yeah, think about just keeping those barriers to a minimum, looking at just even, set your environment so it helps you to motivate yourself to do that. Sorry, Michelle, next slide, please. So I quite like this quote. If you have a goal, write it down. If you do not write it down, you don't have a goal, you've got a wish. And I think that's really helpful, because when you're having a day where you're feeling, oh my gosh, I just don't know that I've got it in me, remembering why it's important to you can make all the difference. So write it down, stick it on the fridge or stick it on the back of the toilet door, somewhere that you are going to see it frequently, because it will help you to just get that little bit more impetus to get going and get on with things. Next slide, please. Look at this lady, doesn't she look joyful? I think if we're going to look at doing anything as a part of our life regularly, it needs to be fun, or it needs to be necessary, but we're going to focus on fun. So she's hula hooping, great balance exercise, great for core. She looks like she's with friends. She's out in nature. She looks like she's having a great time. And that's what we all should be looking for. So this is something that will be individual to everybody. What kind of gets you going? Is it cranking up the music in the house and just having a boogie in the lounge room? Or is it meeting up with a friend and going for a walk? You know, what is it that gets you going, that doesn't feel like a chore? Because if we're anticipating that something's going to be difficult or effortful, that motivation level starts to drop considerably. So find what feels good for you, make it fun, and that way you'll find more time to do it. Okay, next slide, please. Phone a friend, make it social. This links to the previous point, really, doesn't it? We're social beasts. We like hanging out with our mates. It's a little bit tricky at the moment, perhaps, although hopefully this next week becoming a little easier to meet up with friends. But it's good because it helps us to motivate ourselves to do something. But it's also good because when we organize to meet up with a friend, it's a little bit like making a social contract. We're kind of asking them to hold us accountable. And I think with good friends, we can maybe say how important it is to us to meet up regularly, because social isolation has its own health concerns. And sometimes people can start to feel a little isolated with this condition. So get in early, make those links, get out and meet a friend. And then it doesn't feel like hard work. It's just something that you enjoy doing. And that means you'll do it regularly. Next slide, please. Now, this is a really important point, I think. This is something that people can often struggle with. It's managing heat sensitivity. So when with multiple sclerosis, I'm sure you're all aware that it can affect the myelin sheath, which is like the insulation to your nerves. So your nerves can get a little more susceptible to changes in temperature. Now, one of the things that struck me about coming to Auckland is that it's really quite humid here, isn't it? It's much more tropical than, say, Melbourne, where I grew up, and definitely much more tropical than London. And so this could be something that might just make things a little bit more tricky for you, but there's so many ways to start to overcome it. So first of all, being aware that it's a problem. So relating that back to that initial point I made of that people might experience a slight worsening of their symptoms. That can often be to do with heat sensitivity. When we exercise, we get hot. So thinking about keeping ourselves hydrated, making sure you're drinking plenty of water. What's really nice with this is getting one of those thermos cups and chucking sort of crushed up ice and water so that it's less than 0 degrees. That's going to really help you to drop your core temperature quickly to help you stay at a more normal temperature and not experience such worsenings, and can help with your recovery after doing exercise as well. The other thing is wearing light fitting loose clothing to help get air to your skin and your body so you can sweat off that heat. And there are sort of fancy things like cooling vests and things that you can use as well. But I think the other thing that might be more pertinent here would be things like thinking about the time of the day that you exercise. So it's cooler in the mornings and maybe a bit later in the evenings. Or if you really need to exercise in the middle of the day, maybe consider being inside, air conditioning, or having a fan running over you to help with airflow and keeping you cool. There's also some evidence that HIIT training, so high intensity intermittent exercise, so interval training, sorry, can help you to still get all those benefits of cardiovascular exercise and strength training. But because you're having these periods of exercise followed by a period of rest, it actually helps you to just keep cooler, and you can have a sip of water in that time too. So it doesn't actually seem to increase people's core temperature nearly so much as the continuous exercise. The other nice thing about HIIT is that it's usually, because it's intense and short, it doesn't take so much time out of your day. Okay, so that could be something that you might like to try. Next slide, please. Another big one, managing fatigue. So I think life is kind of tiring generally at the moment, isn't it, guys, with COVID? And I don't know if many of you have got like kids at home and you're trying to juggle work, and there's a lot going on. And then on top of that, with the MS, sometimes people can suffer from fatigue as one of their main problems. And I think with this, it links to our earlier chat about thinking about just simple things like breaking up sitting as a first point of call, increasing your lifestyle physical activity so that you're getting up and moving regularly, because they have massive health benefits in themselves. And then you might think about the time of the day that you're exercising to minimize those side effects that we've talked about with heat sensitivity. And the other thing is that when fatigue is often multifaceted, so there might be some fatigue from the multiple sclerosis itself, but there can be other drivers, like say, so if your sleep is not optimal, perhaps looking at your sleep hygiene and talking to some, looking into sleep, how to improve your sleep hygiene, speaking to your consultant or other health professionals as to how you might optimize your sleep would be useful. Thinking about things like, do you need to go to the toilet overnight? Is that disrupting you from getting that really deep, restful sleep? Thinking about the circadian rhythms and allowing yourself to, a bit like if you're training a child to start to sleep better, you'd think about that routine to sort of ease out of the day. And waking up at a regular time can help, or to get that body clock going so that you're waking up and feeling in a more rested state. There are medical interventions, drugs that can help with fatigue, but there's weak evidence to suggest that that actually increases your activity, unfortunately. So thinking about all the different things that might be contributing to that fatigue and addressing them in a proactive way can really make a difference. But I think fundamentally looking at pacing, distributing little bits of activity throughout the day is probably a good way to start biting into that a little bit, getting your activity levels up. Because the literature also tells us that by exercise reduces our fatigue. So we want to try and stop getting into this paradox of feeling fatigued, making it harder for us to exercise, and then feeling more fatigued because we have this weakness and disuse and deconditioning because you're less active. So just starting small and gradually building, I think, would be the best way in. But you can speak to health professionals about that also. Next slide, please, Michelle. And the other thing I've sort of talked about is just addressing other barriers. So thinking about things like balance. Physios can help with balance and to do specific exercises, or looking at incontinence, for example. I think we don't talk about this enough. And this doesn't always have to be related to the MS, but it's a big blocker to people getting active. I'm just aware that multiple sclerosis tends to affect more women than men, although it can affect men as well, obviously, incontinence. But if you've had children, you're at greater risk. And so thinking about that in a proactive way, I think, is really helpful. There's lots of stuff that can be done to help you manage that so that we can get you active. So yeah, speaking to health professionals about other aspects that might be making it harder for you to get active. I think another misconception is that people think about, I've got to go to the gym to exercise. We really don't. You can get active within your own home and your own local community. Going to the playground, or I've been doing like ninja soup videos on the television through YouTube with my daughter to try and get her more active between seeing patients on Zoom. There's so many different options for just getting little bite-sized chunks of activity throughout the day. And lots of people there to help, including the MS Society. And next slide, please. So in summary, there's lots of different reasons for getting active, lots of health benefits to be had, and we know that it can modify the MS journey in a positive way. We need to think about incorporating the different types of exercise, so strength and aerobic types, to get those health benefits that we want across a large spectrum of our body systems. And I think importantly, find what feels good. We don't want this to feel like a chore. It needs to feel like you're working hard, but that's not quite the same as something being a real drag on your kind of positive outlook. And just remember not to be too hard on yourself, guys. Something is better than nothing. And sometimes starting small and building a positive routine can lead to bigger things. So next slide, please. Thank you for your time. I hope that was helpful. And if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them into the chat box.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was a great presentation, super helpful. So now we invite any questions that anybody has. If you pop them into the chat box, then we will have a look through them. Thanks, Michelle.
Absolute pleasure. Pleasure, Kyle.
Michelle, we do have a question that we received in advance, and that was, what exercise should I be doing on the days when I'm unable to do a gym class or a more physical workout due to MS symptoms? This is generally fatigue and can last days or weeks at a time.
Yeah, that is a very common complaint that people have when I see them for physio. And I think I talked to aspects that I've already mentioned. So first of all, don't beat yourself up, because that doesn't actually help you to achieve anything, but it can make you feel even worse than you do already with the fatigue. It is challenging. But I think starting small, even just by breaking up your sitting, walking to the kitchen or doing short walks intermittently can help you to build your endurance and start to get your activity levels up. The other thing is to, building up your general lifestyle, physical activity is important. The other thing I should mention though always is, if you're feeling like a noticeable change in your symptoms, so new symptoms or worsening of existing symptoms that last for more than 24 hours, do speak to your GP about that, because we want to make sure that you're not having a relapse, okay? And it's just worth bearing that in mind. But I think start small and try and make it consistent as much as you can when you're feeling fatigued. Because I think sometimes people will often fall into the trap of, if they wake up one day and they're feeling a little bit better, they'll go, great, I'm feeling so much better. I'm going to do 10,000 things that I've been wanting to do for the last couple of weeks. And what happens is that you end up exhausting yourself. We have this boom and bust relationship. So people, you get a bit of energy and you get active in that, and then you crash down again, and then that might set you back for longer. So think about what you're wanting to achieve, pace yourself little and often, and gradually build over time would be the key things. Consider all of those things that might be driving your fatigue, as we already mentioned in the talk. So making sure your sleep hygiene and optimizing your sleep is paramount as well.
I see we have one more question, which is, you mentioned about how we are less active as the day progresses. Are there more benefits to exercising later in the day?
Okay, so it's not so much this. I was talking probably more to the fact that the literature tells us that people become more sedentary generally, and I think the problem is also that, you know, when you're perhaps feeling fatigued or that you've got limited energy, you kind of want to get things done in the morning, and so people can use all of that energy up in one go and then crash. So a little bit like I just talked to, this boom and bust cycle. So it's not so much that you should do exercise in the morning or the afternoon, it's that Exercise by itself isn't actually enough. So thinking about that structured, repetitive physical activity that we're talking about, so your strengthening and your aerobic exercise, we need to keep more physically active throughout the day, because prolonged periods of sitting is really detrimental to our health. And that's not specific to MS, that's for everybody. So we should be getting up every 45 minutes or so, even if it's just to stand up and sit down a couple of times. But it's not so much that you shouldn't exercise in the morning or you should exercise in the afternoon. It's more about, we want to be thinking about doing some exercise, but also stopping those long periods of just sitting and kind of crashing out when you're feeling tired. So pacing yourself a bit more. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Michelle. Just one last question, which is, at what point should someone see a sleep specialist to assist with sleep hygiene?
Yeah, I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding about sleep is that you should wake feeling rested most of the time. All of us have bad nights now and again. I've got a toddler, so I really understand that. But you should be sort of regularly feeling like you're waking ready for the day. Things that you might be aware of would be, say, if you're a snorer, or if you are having vivid dreams, or if you wake with a headache every day, or you're just never feeling that, like you've had that restorative sleep, I would be absolutely going to see your GP as a first point of call. Just because sleep affects everything. It affects your ability to exercise, it affects your ability to feel well in yourself and your emotional well-being, it affects your energy levels. It's so pervasive. So I think it's a really important aspect of our health generally. And certainly if you're wanting to keep active and exercise, you need to be waking up feeling rested. So earlier rather than later, I think.
There's one final question that's come through, which is, I enjoy doing yoga mainly because it helps stretching out my stiff muscles, but I'm not sure if it gives me sufficient muscle strengthening or aerobic exercise. Do you have any advice around yoga types? And we also have Jess talking to us next, so she may be able to help with that too.
I'd love to link in with Jess's talk, actually. I really like yoga too. And I play around with different types, actually. I think I'd trust your instinct on that. If you're feeling, I think yoga is fabulous because it does help us to make lots of different shapes that we don't make with our bodies during the week when we're walking on flat pavements and sitting at desks at chairs, and our movements can become really stereotypical. So I think that's super helpful for our flexibility and our ability to find different movements within our body. The other lovely thing about yoga is that there's a lot of focus on breath, and I think that's another whole topic of conversation. But breathing muscles, all of them are postural stability muscles as well, just in the nature that they control our trunk as well as move our rib cage for our bellows of our lungs. So I think yoga is fabulous. But if you're not feeling like your muscles are working regularly, so we talked about strength training as you needing to feel like you're after 10 repetitions, for example, that you have worked your major muscle groups to the point where they are sort of 6 to 8 out of 10 tired, then you won't be getting those benefits or enough of that benefit to really optimize your strengths. And similarly, with your respiratory function, your breathing, sort of monitoring how you're responding to that task and whether you're hitting those targets, I think is important. But that's not to say that yoga is not helpful. I think it's incredibly helpful for a lot of people, including myself. Yeah, but I think a diversity of different types of exercise and exploring different movements is fabulous. Dancing is fabulous too. I didn't mention that today.